All right, welcome to the show, Stephen Albini. Stephen is the singer and guitarist for Shellac. He's also engineered over 2,000 albums, including some of my favorite ones, PG Harvey, Rid of Me, Nirvana, In Utero, and the Pixies, Surfer Rosa. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show.
No sweat.
Cool. Well, I was just kind of going through your history, and I'm just kind of curious. I read that the Ramones album for you was sort of your the first album that sort of either did it for you or kind of rocked your world. And I was just sort of wondering if you could bring us back to that time and sort of describe how the music scene was prior to that album and what that album did for you.
Yeah, well, bear in mind, I heard that record when I was a teenager and I was in high school, and I didn't really have a conception of the music scene, or, you know, I hadn't really paid attention to music up to that point. Like, my folks had a hi-fi and they had a collection of like folk music and hillbilly records and stuff like that, but I'd never really taken music seriously. But when you're an adolescent, you start to form your personality in your peer group, like within your peer group, and there's a kind of a hive mind. And in my peer group, there was a lot of ball breaking, a lot of just petty adolescent aggression, and a lot of snarkiness, sarcasm, a lot, we were sort of getting into trash culture, like underground comics and, horror films and that sort of stuff. And to come stumbling across the Ramones was kind of a validation of that mindset, of that sort of like made it seem like all of these fleeting ideas that we had as adolescents, like those could be expanded on and turned into real art. And that record, it became a kind of a talisman for me. Like I played the Stripes off that record, and I converted my friends into Ramones fans simultaneously, and through this idea of the Ramones idea of taking like non-serious subjects and trash culture and transgressive ideas and making them their entire artistic framework, that changed my perspective on what sorts of things I should take seriously in the world, like what kinds of ideas I should consider legitimately, what of other people I should consider rather than dismissing, what kinds of other people were, serious people. It literally changed everything about the way I thought, because up to that point I'd had a sort of conventional upbringing where, conventional family structure, conventional like work and home life structure, conventional education,
Normal American life,
all that sort of thing. I was growing up in Montana. It's a fairly conservative place, and I don't just mean conservative politically. I mean conservative in that people don't like to be surprised. People want to, they want to go the same places they've always gone. They want to see the same people they've always seen. They don't want to have any new ideas wiggled in front of them. They just want to carry on the way they've always carried on. And so that record, the Ramones album, was a real, and then the existence of the Ramones, and like the more I learned about them, like everything about them just became a kind of a lens through which I could see the world in a different way. I was a teenager, so I was impressionable, and I can imagine an alternate reality where somebody played me a Rush album or something, and I developed a whole different series of tendencies and ideas, and I'm ecstatic that I ended up discovering the Ramones and not something that would have been a negative influence on my life.
At that time, was punk music, punk culture, even a word or a term being thrown around?
There were occasional hints of punk as an identity and punk thought, occasional hints of it being dropped in places like Rolling Stone and Cream magazine, and the local newsstand. There's a newsstand and bookstore called the Warden Market in Missoula, the town that I grew up in. And Warden's Market had a newsstand, a magazine rack that had periodicals from around the world in it, and they got the English music papers. So once I was aware of punk as a thing, I knew that I could find some hints about it in the English music papers. And like I didn't get any, I wasn't able to get any of the like actual punk media, like none of the punk fanzines made it out to Montana, but some of the records did in the secondhand record store in town. There were a couple of secondhand record stores, as is true in any college town.
Mm-hmm.
Go to the college town with their possessions, and then when they need beer money or whatever, they spend their possessions. And
Yeah.
one of the things that happened was there was a kind of an infusion of culture from people coming there to go to college, and then like when they finished, or when they were, went broke, they would like unload all their books and records and pot pipes and stuff. And then also the secondhand stores in Missoula and the secondhand market in Missoula was really a great sort of archaeological or anthropological thing for me.
Nice. So did you kind of have it set from that point on, like you were going to commit to music and you kind of knew like balls to the wall, this is what you're going to do? Or
No, not at all. It never occurred to me that I could make a living in the music world, in the music community at all. That was the furthest thing from my mind. When I left Montana to go to come to Chicago to go to college when I was 18. Actually, I think I left when I was 17. I turned 18 on the trip or whatever. But at any rate, when I got to Chicago as a teenager, I was here to go to school. I presumed that I would have a normal work life after college. And I just gradually, over the course of the first few years that I was here, I gradually insinuated myself into the music scene here. And that just became a very rewarding part of my life that I never, ever thought was going to be my vocation, And I should point out that was true for essentially everybody involved in music at the time. Like everybody that I knew, all my friends and peers who were also like me, like, animated by this music, like all of us had jobs. Nobody ever imagined a world where we could be in a band full time as a way of making a living, or where you could work in music in some other way full time as a profession. Like that just never even crossed anybody's mind.
yeah.
And so you would do all of these things, like you would play shows with your band, or you would host a visiting band from out of town, like put them up at your house, or you would find shows for an out-of-town band that needed a place to play in town, or print flyers and hang flyers for your friends' gigs, or if somebody had a camera, they would take promo photos for a band. If somebody had access to printing equipment, they could make T-shirts for their band or their friends' bands, or print up posters, or like all of this stuff. Like literally all of it was just being done in service of the sort of greater good for the music scene.
Yeah.
wanting to make things better for everybody.
Right.
And occasionally small amounts of money changed hands, but those were mostly like sort of token gestures. It's like, oh yeah, I feel bad about you driving all the way out here to play the show and nobody turned out for it, but here I can, here take gas money or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you could charge a cover charge for a show and collect the money and give that to the visiting band. But you would never dream of taking a piece for yourself, for example.
Yeah.
Like you were just a mechanism by which the door charge was being collected for this visiting band or whatever.
Well, by the time you got into or started Big Black, things were happening for you, I'm assuming. And
that was the first thing that I did that was taken seriously. That was the first thing. Yeah, I made a demo recording essentially on my own, as a kind of a recruitment aid, I guess is what you'd call it, like as a way to demonstrate the kind of music I wanted to make to people, to see if I could get other people interested in being in a band. And that ended up becoming the first Big Black record. Was that demo tape that I recorded I ended up being able to release that as a record before I was able to put together a band. So once that record was out, then I was able to find some other people to play with, namely Jeff Pizzotti from Naked Ray Gun, who were at the time my favorite band and the best band in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Santiago Durango, who was previously the guitar player in that band and was kind of one of my idols.
Yeah.
The two of them agreed to be in the band with me, and I couldn't have been happier. It was like, if you can imagine a kid in the 60s like idolizing the Rolling Stones and then starting a band on his own, and Mick Jagger and Charlie Watts agreeing to be in his band. It was like kind of at that level of awesome for me,
Yeah. And they were in the Chicago area?
Yeah, everybody lives in Chicago, yeah.
Okay. Now, was that the first time, I'm assuming you had sort of, when you put that demo together, was that your first time engineering, or had you done it for years prior to that?
I had done it sort of semi-informally, very informally, and then semi-informally since the late 70s. Like my band in Montana, we had recorded ourselves a couple of times. Then when I came to Chicago, and I was in this peer group of other musicians who were all in bands, and they all wanted to record themselves, and I would help them out because I had, a minimum of experience having done it already. So I would help my friends' bands out recording demos. And
Mm-hmm.
then occasionally bands would go into a proper studio to do a session. And at the time, the people who worked in the small studios typically made a living doing radio jingles, and so had a very limited conception of music. And so I would often be asked to go in to the studio with my friends' bands and act as a kind of a mediator between the band and the engineer, producer, owner, or whatever of the smaller studios, so that they wouldn't get the wrong idea about what kind of music the band was trying to make, so that they could be placated about whether, yep, that's what it's supposed to sound like.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of more of a diplomatic role than a technical role. But I didn't, I used those as opportunities to learn recording techniques and methods, and then I would practice when I would be doing things on my own, I would get to put those methods into practice. And eventually I bought a house, and after I graduated from college, I got a regular job as a photograph retouch and photo composition artist for a company that did images for advertising. And I worked at that job for 4 or 5 years, and I bought a house and converted the basement of that house into a practice room, rehearsal space, and recording studio.
Hmm.
So then I had a recording studio at my disposal like every day. And so from that point on, like my bands and my friends' bands and my friends' friends were all sort of congregating at my house and recording fairly constantly.
So you were never formally trained. You just sort of picked this up as you kind of went along?
I read essentially everything I could find about the technical aspects of recording in the Northwestern University library, and then all the Chicago Public Library and the public library back home in Montana. That's how I got my start. And the university, my dad was occasionally taught classes at the University of Montana, so I had access to the University of Montana library as well. They had a pretty good technical library. So like, public libraries are really underrated, and university libraries are really underrated resources. You can learn an awful lot if you're driven and you have an avenue to experiment, and you have access to a good library. You can teach yourself quite a bit.
Yeah. My next question was about the sound of Big Black. Were you trying to emulate someone? Were you trying, or at that time, what do you think you were trying to sound like, in your opinion?
Well, there are a few very specific influences that I was openly mimicking. There was a band called Suicide, who are an electronic duo from New York, and I just openly mimicked them in some ways. There were bands like Tuxedo Moon and the Cure, who had a kind of a clean and brittle aesthetic, and that seemed just about manageable for me to do on my own.
Yeah.
And then once the live band started, my biggest influence, like when I say the live band, once Santiago and Jeff joined the band, and it stopped being just an exercise of me executing my own ideas and became a proper functioning band, then they were easily my biggest influences. Jeff and Santiago were my biggest influences. And then, you know, other music of the day, things like bands like Gang of Four and Pylon and Killing Joke and the Pop Group and Chrome and Public Image Limited, all these experimental post-punk bands were influential on me as a thinker and influential on me aesthetically. And I'm certain that I mimicked a lot of those. Certain moments in those records were retranslated and became moments in our records, I'm sure.
Yeah. So moving on to when you started doing the engineering for other bands, it seems like, I mean, I don't know if this was like this at the beginning, but specifically starting with the Pixies, so did your name just start getting sort of thrown around as sort of the guy to, you know, for me, you have this reputation of a sound that no one else can sort of reproduce, at least for me. And at that time, was your reputation, I mean, was starting to sort of, this is the guy to have?
I don't think so. I mean, specifically the Pixies, they were the very first band that I had ever worked, whose records I'd worked on, where I had no prior connection to them. They were literally the first ones, the first people to ever call me up out of the blue and say, you know, would you work on our record? And it just so happened that they were a very good band operating at a very high level. And so whoever made that Pixies record would have gotten some credit by way of reflected light from how good that band was operating within their own terms. I think I did a competent job on that record, which I'm pleased about. And I'm glad that my ambitions as a pushy guy were somewhat held in check on that record, because I think I could have done a lot of damage to that record if I had let my ego get ahead of me a little. But
well, definitely, yes, definitely. What I've noticed in your interviews, you're very humble about your influence on the music, on the band. But definitely looking at your history, there's definitely, in my opinion, like a thumbprint of where you are. I mean, it's hard to deny as far as you being there, at least being a witness to kind of what's going on. And just, go ahead.
I should point out, though, that like the records that I've worked on, if you look at the records that I've worked on for bands that had a very long tenure or bands that had a significant career, I typically didn't work on the record that was their biggest success. I would typically work on one of the other records, either a record that preceded very big success or the record that followed very big success. So I think it's a mistake to give me a significant amount of credit for the success of people who either clearly were already successful or became successful after my involvement. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I flatter myself in thinking that I'm a competent engineer and that I can make a nice representative recording of a band that flatters their aesthetic, without feeling like I really deserve the kind of credit that I am sometimes offered, you know?
Yeah. Well, definitely we'll bookmark that and keep it for the whole show. But I definitely want to pat you on the back for the work you've done, and just know the input on my life, for example, to hear your albums, there's no other music that, and I think you see this from other artists too that work with you that sort of say the same thing, like working with you can get a sound that you just, you have that sound. And so I guess Mike, one of the songs that kind of just stands out for me is Bone Machine and the drums. And I'm not an engineer, not my field at all, but I just know hearing how you do, like how you create or not to create the music, but capture it, especially like for that song in general. If you can go back, you're kind of known for kind of having microphones all over the place. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's overstating it. Like, literally the difference between that drum recording and all of the other drum recordings that were done in that same studio by other competent engineers is that you can hear the ambient sound in the room more. The drum,
Mm.
it was a nice big room that had a really lovely sort of flap, almost a slap echo quality in the room. And it had really well supported low end. So in most studio recordings, there's a lot of attention paid to the close mics on the drums. Like you might move the bass drum microphone around 4 or 5 times, you know, retune the bass drum, swap the microphone out, try it with a pillow in it, take the pillow out, put a blanket over it, take the blanket off, you know, focusing intently on the close mics on the individual drums, and then build the sound of the drum kit up from these individual sounds that have been sort of optimized on you know, like this is the ideal bass drum, this is the perfect snare drum, this is the rack tom of God and the floor tom of hell, like, you know, and then now I have this assembled thing of individual sounds. And
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, turn the ambient microphones on and listen to the ambient sound. If it sounds okay, leave it in. You know, my approach has always been to operate from the perspective of the drummer. Like when the drummer is sitting in the room playing, the majority of the sound is not like an ear up next to the drum kind of perspective. It's a perspective of the whole drum kit spread out in front of you, with the whole room folding back in on you and contributing to the effect of playing in the room. So my benchmark has always been, if you can start from a position of naturalism, like start from a realistic perspective, like when I play the drums sitting in this position, that's what it sounds like. If you go into the control room and it comes back like that, that's a very good place to start, because you know you haven't introduced any anomalies at that point. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if you can make the recording sound like the real experience as near as damn it, then that's the best starting point. Now, of course, things can get stylized from there, and you can make things abstracted further and further from that if you want. But I mean, bearing in mind that I started with a minimal complement of equipment, minimalist recording techniques, and I was thrilled to be able to get any result whatsoever, talking about doing these, you know, minimal punk rock demos.
Yeah.
When I was afforded a full studio with a complete array of microphones and a nice acoustic sounding room, like the goal for me was not to try to assemble these ideal sounds piecemeal, but to take advantage of the natural organic sound that was there already. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
David Lovering is a great drummer. His drum kit sounded lovely. He spent some energy tuning and buffing that drum kit so that it suited his style of play, and he liked the way it sounded. So
Yeah.
his voice, his personality was baked into what his drums sounded like. And my first job as an engineer was to try to take that whole thing, his style of playing drums, the relative weight of the different parts of the drum kit, the tone and intensity of the individual instruments of the drum kit, take that and move it into your living room so that you get to
Mm-hmm.
experience it the way he did. That's job one, is just to sort of bring that sense memory alive for everybody that hears it. And I was real satisfied with the way it came out on that session, but I promise you that any competent engineer that was sensitive to what was going on in the band and in the session would have been able to make a great record with them.
Awesome. What do you think your guiding sort of ethos is when you step inside and work with these bands? You said earlier that your ego can sometimes get in the way, and if you push too hard, you probably could have disrupted what they had in the studio. What is your general guideline?
Well, I mean, that perspective is informed by a couple of things. One of them was coming up like my awareness of music started with my involvement with punk rock, and punk rock was always adversarial and confrontational. And in a lot of instances, a band would go into a studio, like the one studio that they could afford, or the one studio in town, whatever. And the engineer would be not necessarily a peer. Like he might feel like it was beneath him to be recording this trash music, you know, or he might feel like his experience recording the best blues bands on the South Side gave him a kind of ironclad perspective on what music should sound like. And if your noisy, scratchy punk band doesn't suit his aesthetic, it'd be very difficult for him to translate it accurately. So that was a problem that a lot of bands encountered, was that they would, the person who was entrusted with making the record with them was not sympathetic or didn't get their music. And as a result, a lot of those independent punk records of the day have a kind of a stilted sound, like they sound weaker and smaller than those bands were in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Because the people working on them, this is an important point, the people working on them, these engineers who didn't get it, they were operating with the best intention. Like, they wanted things to be better. They wanted to help this naive young band that didn't have their shit together. They wanted to help them make a better recording. The problem is that for them, better was correlated with an aesthetic that was at odds to the punk aesthetic. So
would you describe it as more polished?
Less confrontational is probably less abrasive,
okay. Mm-hmm.
less tidier, less messy, less distorted, less aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
All those things, all those adjectives.
Yeah.
If your goal in life is to record a Doobie Brothers record, and you're confronted with some atonal noise from a messy punk band, and you try your best to make it sound like the Doobie Brothers because that's your perception of greatness, you're going to do some damage to that recording. It's not going to reflect what the band is on about, right? That's a natural human failing, and I'm not specifically faulting these people. I'm just saying that one of the things that has guided my approach in the studio is having seen bands get their fingers burned by that experience, where somebody tried to help by interfering with their process or interfering with their aesthetics. And again, I want to stress that this is somebody with the best intention. Like, it's not like he's trying to sabotage this band or mock this band. He just doesn't get what they're shooting at, and so he's directing them in a way or controlling them in a way that makes his life easier or gives him some peace of mind, makes him feel like he's participating, makes him feel like he's, contributing something. But ultimately it's to the detriment of the project, to the detriment of the band and the people in it. And so I've tried very hard not to make that mistake. I've tried very hard not to, while operating, I've tried not to operate from my perceived aesthetics, but I've tried to be sympathetic to what the band's perceived aesthetics are.
What happens, or hypothetically, if you've ever gotten in a situation before where you're with the band and maybe they are more of the Doobie Brothers or a pop style, and I'm not sure if you know that prior to recording the band, their style, you can go with it, but have you ever found yourself in a situation and go, oh fuck, what am I doing?
Well, yes, of course. But I mean, the main thing is that once you've developed a sort of working vocabulary and a nominally expansive toolkit, like once you're able to record things competently, the very first time you encounter a violin can be quite daunting because you don't know what to do, so you don't know which mic to use, you don't know where to put the mic. The 40th or 50th time you've recorded violins, you've probably got a pretty clear picture in your head what you should do to record violins. The 700th time, it's a piece of cake, and that's true for every single chore in recording. Is like, it's a mystery at first, make some mistakes and some clumsy choices at first, you correct yourself, you educate yourself along the way, and then the next time it's easier, the time after that it's easier, the time after that it's easier. So and once you get to a point where you have a sort of baseline competence at recording, then it doesn't matter what kind of music it is. Like genuinely doesn't matter. You could bring any sort of music whatsoever into the studio, and if they can play their music as an ensemble, if they can make the sound, I can find a way to record it in a way that isn't going to drop the ball,
Mm-hmm. What is your opinion on sort of the state of music today?
Music, that is the community of musicians and their art, I think is great.
Mm-hmm.
it's obviously easier than ever to communicate. So like if a band has a recording that they want to get out to the world, they don't have to wait on a record label's timeline. They don't have to pay anything to distribute it. They can just put it up on their SoundCloud or YouTube or their Bandcamp or whatever, and you know, have at it. The whole world gets access to it then. And that is incredible. That's an awesome development. I simply can't find fault with a mechanism whereby any band, any person can create something and share it with the world instantly for free. That just seems, that seems like an incredible cultural development, and I just can't imagine, I just can't see anything wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
The business of music is at the moment in a state of collapse because touring has collapsed. The previous collapse was the collapse of record sales when streaming and online distribution became prevalent. So there was the major institutions of music sort of suffered during the transition from physical distribution of CDs and records to online distribution through streams and downloads. So that whole structure, that whole corporate structure collapsed and is now kind of a trivial part of the music business. Live touring, live shows, local shows, festival, you know, touring festivals, residential festivals, those things became much more important because they became a bigger part of the revenue stream for a working musician. It's like you weren't going to be getting record royalties, but you could play 200 shows a year, you know, that sort of thing. And now in the pandemic, live shows are out the window. Nobody's selling any records. You know, there really isn't an avenue to monetize your existence as a musician right now. I mean, people are sort of getting by with streaming platforms and like, you know, Patreons and things like that. Like, and those are fine as a sort of a stopgap. But ultimately, what's going to survive, you know, what's going to change things, get things back on their feet, is going to be, you know, solving the problem with the pandemic. Like, once there's a widely available vaccine and it's no longer, you know, completely stopping congregating of people, then people will be able to congregate and go to concerts and have band practice and go to the record store and all those kinds of things.
So looking at the sort of the rock punk music scene, do you see there being still steady influence and maybe it's pushed more underground, or do you think it's declined in your lifetime?
I think there's the term underground had value, like had meaning when there were these gatekeeper systems, like when there was a sort of monolithic radio, which meant that there was like a top 40 radio playlist that pretty much all major market radio stations would use. Everybody heard the same music. Everybody was familiar with the same stuff. If your music didn't fit that paradigm, it was underground, right?
Yeah.
Or you know, major label records were distributed through department stores and chain record stores. And if you were on a small label or an independent label and you only had access to specialty mom and pop shops, you were, by default, you were an underground artist. You know, like you were underground, you were in the underground because you weren't part of the mainstream. Like the mainstream had these actual structures and rules about who and what would be admitted to it. And if you weren't part of that, then you weren't part of it and you were in the underground, right? That's all gone away now because people are much more self-deterministic in what they listen to. Like if you look at, just pick up any of your friends' phones and look at their playlists, you know, like they're listening to the weirdest, most random collection of stuff, like shit you've never heard of 80% of the time. And if you pick up on somebody else's phone and look at their playlist, they're listening to a completely disassociated, completely different, but very personal choice of music. Like each person is now kind of scripting their listening experience on a really granular level. And I think that's also an incredible development. I think it's amazing and really gratifying that this kind of deterministic culture has been defeated. Like, it used to be that, like, for example, in England, the major music papers could declare that someone was a successful artist, and they would be, you know, or in America, like MTV could declare something as a popular video and just play it all the time, and then it was, you know.
Yeah.
The radio pluggers would pay radio stations to play their chosen records, and you know, then de facto those records are being played in every city in America. People are hearing them in every city in America. They are de facto hit records.
Yeah.
Even though they didn't become hit records through people liking them, they became hit records because there was a mechanism in place whereby they can be, you know, insinuated into the culture and people would have to hear them.
Right.
That stuff, that doesn't exist anymore, which I think is awesome.
Yeah.
Like the collapse of that kind of corrupt sort of exporting of culture, that collapse has been really a gratifying part of the collapse of the music business. Now, a lot of careers were shortened. A lot of people who were making a living doing what I do, for example, or working in admin and record labels, a lot of those people aren't doing that anymore. They're all selling insurance or, you know, Airbnb-ing in their spare room or whatever. But but I think it's a great development culturally that people now get to pick what they want to listen to, and given the power to pick whatever they want to listen to, it's the weirdest shit, like the most amazing. You come across a normal, square, regular person, someone who back in the day would only be familiar with the top 40, like the very tippy top of mainstream culture, right? And this person has somehow like stumbled into this deep dub reggae groove, or this, like, you know, European 20th century classical music thing, like, yeah, I'm really getting into Ligeti, you know, like like those things that didn't happen before. Like, people, it took so much more effort for people to uncover stuff previously, that now people are just indulging the most eclectic tastes everywhere, and I think it's great. I think it's fantastic.
One of the things that, you know, one of the things I guess I kind of miss, and I'm thinking back to my day of like watching 120 minutes on MTV and getting to hear, maybe I mean, right now there just seems to be so much music. The problem almost seems reversed, where it's like, well, how, I mean, I don't want someone telling me what to listen to, but there also is a collective movement that goes on with music that seems to represent an idea, maybe the movement of the youth, that seems right now, it's like, well, where is it? Is it in this, you know?
Well, you know, when I was younger and I was at my peer group of other musicians were, like I said, were huge influences on me. The records they liked, I wanted to listen to. And I liked a lot of those records. And you would go to the record store where you would get those records, and the guy behind the counter would be playing some other wacky record, and you'd want that, you know, hey, what is this wacky record you're playing? That's great. Give me one of those as well. Like that kind of curating, that sort of interaction with your peers and friends, that informs your musical taste and experience. And that's still the case. The problem is that if you're no longer in that cultural milieu, if you're no longer hanging out with musicians all the time, if you're no longer hitting the record store every week, if you're no longer hanging out at the clubs with all your deadbeat friends, then the influences come in more subtle ways. Like you might be on a text thread with a bunch of your old friends, and one of them hips you to something that you had just found out, that he just found out about, and then so, okay, well, now go down that rabbit hole. Or you might, you know, be in some other community, you might be in some sort of online community, and the people in that online community might have musical tastes that are synced up with yours, and you'll hear about it that way. It's way more diffuse now, but it's, you know, it's not, music is not a passive experience. Like being an enthusiast in music is not a passive experience. You can just let things happen at random around you, but if you get into music and you want to find things that are stimulating to you, it requires effort on your part, the way it always did. The difference is that now, instead of you having to get on a bus and go downtown and look through 3 shops before you found the one that had the record that you'd heard about, and then buy the record and bring it home and take it out of the sleeve and put the needle on it and then discover that it sucks, Like that, all of that can be taken care of with a few characters in Google, and
Yeah.
you know, and before you know it, you know that this record sucks and you don't need to worry about it anymore, you know.
But obviously you're plugged in. Do you have a source or somewhere that you go to regularly kind of see what's going on out there?
I mean, bear in mind, I work in a recording studio where there are, you know, young and active musicians
Yeah.
coming in all the time. And so I'm
Right.
constantly being exposed to a steady stream of new music that I've never heard before and I've never heard before. So I find that quite gratifying. And also
Yeah.
the social bonds that you make with people through that experience, you know, then every now and again you'll get a text message from somebody about some wacky record they've just discovered that you should hear.
Yeah.
Or you'll run into somebody and you know, he'll say, oh man, have you heard this? And that initial contact that you made with that person might have been through some professional capacity rather than from them being hanging out in the bar that you hang out at, you know.
Yeah.
So I
So
mean,
is there,
all those social avenues are still there, all those networks are still there, but like I said, it's a contact sport, you know. You have to make an effort to expose yourself to music.
is there a band or album that, you know, someone recommended and then 5 hours later they said the same? Anything lately like that that has really stuck out for you that you've really enjoyed?
Because I'm busy most of the time, partly because I'm old and I don't go out very often. I'm now discovering bands later in their career arc than I was when I was younger. So like by the time I come across a band, they've got a couple records under their belt typically. The last band that I stumbled on, like sort of at random, that really spun my prop was there's this band called Black Midi from England, and their last album I think is just magnificent. And then I got to see them live, really terrific live bands, you know, just a lot of ideas boiling directly under the surface, and nobody on stage is telling you the whole story. There's a lot of, like, you can listen to the singer and listen to the rhythm guitar and you get the picture of the whole thing. With that band, like, everybody on stage is doing something that's kind of running interference from everybody else. And you have to synthesize it internally. Like, you have to take it all in and it synthesizes internally into an aesthetic. It's a really disorienting experience, and I just really enjoyed it. It was very active listening experience for me, and I really enjoyed it, just both on record and live. I thought they were just terrific.
Now, would you ever reach out for them, or do you usually wait for them to people to contact you?
I did like sort of go up to them and gush at them at a show, and then they came by and took a tour of the studio just because I had the morning off the next day. And it was great to meet them, and it was great to be able to to tell them that I liked them and I thought they were great. And you know, I'm normally pretty circumspect about pressing the flesh with other people, just because I don't want anybody to be creeped out by it. I don't want anybody to feel like they're like, oh, that guy that we were
oh, it's Albini again.
We were just talking about how that guy mixes the vocals too low, and we didn't want, you know, and here he is, like I'm very circumspect about that sort of thing. But the older I get, the more I realize that we just have so few opportunities to tell somebody else that they're to validate somebody else and tell them that what they're doing is awesome and that you appreciate it. I've lost all of my inhibitions in that regard now. I'm not shy about, like, if I come across somebody I think is awesome now, I have no compunctions whatsoever about telling how great they are.
Awesome. And Steve, my final, oh, go ahead. Were you gonna say something? I was gonna say my final, oh, go ahead.
Just recently, I've been working on a record with a really long-standing Chicago prog rock band, this band Cheer Accident, who've been going since like 1980, somewhere in there. They've made a shit million records. They've been around forever. Their music is always crazy and engaging and really odd. And I'm an enormous fan of this band. And I'm not just a fan of their music. I'm a fan of their perseverance and their willingness to keep on trudging no matter what, you know. Like 30, 40 years of utter indifference from the rest of the world means nothing to them. They're still happy to do it, you know. I'm really into that. Awesome. That's the sort of thing.
Definitely seems like, even with what you do and your philosophy toward things, there still seems to be that punk spirit in it.
Well, I mean, my personality and my tastes and all that sort of stuff were formed during the punk era. and I don't want to think that that means I only appreciate one kind of music, but I do feel like my mindset, which is this sort of independent mindset and the sort of self-deterministic, self-sufficient mindset, that has been a useful perspective in a period when everything is changing around you, when culture is changing, and you know, the business conditions are changing, and the entire industry that you operate within, when all that's changing, if you've committed to a notion of self-sufficiency and self-determination, then all that other stuff can change and you can adapt to it, right?
Yeah.
If what you're doing is constantly tied to what the rest of the world is doing, then when the rest of the world changes its mind, suddenly you have to change your mind. You have to behave differently. You have to do, and then that, by default, that means you're discarding, you know, your entire body of work up to that point. You're discarding your ideas and your notions and the things that you said had value then, which you now have to admit have no value. Like,
Right.
that's just a queasiness that I wouldn't wish on anybody, you know?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think the value of authenticity and not selling out comes through in all the music either you've created or engineered over the years. My final question for you is, what advice would you have to upcoming musicians, artists? What advice would you give them?
Well, the number one thing is to find people that think like you do. Find people that you're sympathetic with, and that you can communicate with easily, and where you have, like, if not a common aesthetic, at least you appreciate things in common. So find people that think like you do, and that you get along with, and that you can trust, and cling to them. You know, like,
Yeah.
make that the goal. Forming a peer group of people that you admire and respect and want to work with, make that the goal rather than some external measure of success, you know? Because if you get a good band together and you enjoy each other's company and you're making music that stimulates you, then you've won, and you can keep doing that forever. You can do that for your whole life. It doesn't matter if you sell records or make money or anybody comes to your shows. If you have that together, if you have that camaraderie and the social bond, you know, the personal bond of finding people that you like and trust, and that you can work with on that basis, you can keep that going forever, you know. And that's I think everybody's fondest hope is that they can get involved in music, and that they can keep being involved in music, like they get to keep doing it, you know. The other thing is just don't quit. Like, if you run afoul of some, you know, if you have some bad luck, just, you know, appreciate what you can learn from the bad luck and carry on, you know. If nothing ever makes you stop. You stop because all the external stuff is just too much for you. And if you can work in a way that the external stuff doesn't force your hand, then you can find a way to navigate, you know, and adapt to a lot of different changing conditions. And that also sort of argues for the longevity of the experience. Like, you get to keep doing it if they can't stop you. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show and talking to me. And thank you so much for the work you've done over the years. I really appreciate it.
Very nice of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
All righty.